In this video we're going to be comparing the INFJ with the ENFJ, starting with what the two types share in common. Not only do these types share the same functions, but the way in which these functions are paired are also similar. Both types have extroverted sensing paired with extroverted feeling. These are the external functions. Both types have introverted intuition paired with introverted thinking. These are the internal functions. On the extroverted side, this tends to, in practice, make for a high sensitivity to social nuance, but significantly more difficulty with groups and more fast-paced, socially dynamic situations. Regarding introverted thinking, both types tend to excel at the more nebulous, principle-based approaches to logic, the general pattern of life. And they tend to struggle more on the side of precision and logical details. And this can include sequences. Sharing an extroverted feeling over introverted feeling preference, both types tend to prioritize the regulation of the external emotional world over that of their internal world. While both types do have ample access to introverted feeling, this introverted feeling tends to be informed more by an extroverted feeling gateway, and thus more dependent upon societal role and affirmation than independent of them. With extroverted feeling as a preference, external social harmony tends to be prioritized more for its own sake, and thus there is a harder time for both of these types to apply an introverted feeling filter to that social harmony that is their concern, directly impacts them, and that which is not. As such, any kind of social disharmony tends to cause both of these types distress, and they can therefore share a tendency to mask any kind of internal turmoil they are suffering with in favor of contributing to a socially disharmonious environment. And this sensitivity is exacerbated by the SEFE pairing of these types. Extroverted sensing, being a much more precise external lens, is by its very nature more nuanced and sensitive, but also much more confined to a smaller scope of operations. As such, both of these types tend to lean more towards one-on-one interaction and can feel significantly more uncomfortable and awkward in new social situations where the parameters of operation have not yet been established. As such, ENFJs themselves can appear socially introverted when placed in new and unfamiliar social environments. Both the ENFJ and the INFJ actually have an innate privacy owing to their very sensitivity to social feedback, and it is therefore fallacious to assume either of these types being the life or soul of a party just because they are extroverted feelers. The sensitivity of SEFE and the holisticism of NITI makes for two types who both reduce their locus of immediate social affect while increasing their societal locus of global impact. As such, in person, each of these types can gravitate more towards one-on-one and intimate relationships over group settings, all the while maximizing their contribution on a more societal level. So as you can see, both of these types share a lot in common. But now let's get into how they differ. So before we get into the attitudes and dip functions of these types, it's important to differentiate between the lens-dominant INFJ and the codec dominant ENFJ. A lens function takes in information, and a codec function assigns value to that information. So, depending upon the emphasis of a type, this can make for a very different agenda. While both of these types enjoy a good bit of philosophical musing, and also crave maximal societal impact, the order of these desires tend to differ. For the INFJ, NITI formulation tends to take priority over the imparting of this information for the betterment of society. There is a natural joy in discovery for the NI dominant, and many INFJs actually quite enjoy hoarding the product of their various formulations without necessarily having much compulsion to share them with others. The FESE social impact for this type tends to be more secondary to NITI formulation, and the FE authority of the INFJ tends to instill more social parameters and laws to abide by, more than a social role to fulfill. And for the ENFJ, this tends to be flipped. While both types do enjoy a good bit of NITI formulation, the emphasis for the codec dominant is upon the use of this formulation, more than the formulation process itself. The FE dominant tends more to prioritize the impact of introverted thinking frameworks, and there's a more natural call to arms here to share this information with other people as fast as possible. And due to this greater action orientation, there's more emphasis to take such TINI outside of the conceptual and into the empirical. Because of course, the more evidence a theory accrues, the higher chance of everybody agreeing that it is correct. The NI authority here tends to drive social impact for this type, reminding the ENFJ there is a job to do, a role to fulfill. And this tends to make all but the most divergent ENFJ subtypes rather restless should they stay within the NITI dreamland for too long. Now let's get into the attitudes of these types. The dominant FE-SE pairing of the ENFJ is convergent, whereas the opposing pairing of the INFJ, SE, FE, is divergent. And we can think of these differences in terms of the fight or flight response. As extroverted feeling is highly valued by both of these types, social disharmony tends to be equally quite activating. Convergent extroverted feeling would tend to take a high level of ownership over any social disharmony, immediately going into fix-it mode, and henceforth goes about trying to restore social order as quickly as possible. And with this responsibility there also comes a high guilt orientation, because the ENFJ is less likely to detach from a social situation gone wrong, and more likely to beat themselves up for not fulfilling their role correctly. For the INFJ, however, extroverted feeling tends to trigger for this type more of a flight response. For this type, social parameters tend to be more naturally constrictive to be abided by, and there is less natural feelings of empowerment to be able to change an immediate social situation for the better. The INFJ is actually the more likely of the two types to distance themselves from a social situation. You see, rather than actually fleeing the room in panicky fashion, the flight response of the INFJ's extroverted feeling is simply into introverted thinking detachment. The retreat is more into themselves than it is actually externally into a different place. Faced with social disharmony, the INFJ's natural inclination is to remove themselves from the situation to some extent, retreating into introverted thinking, introverted intuition, in order to run diagnostics towards solving the underlying issue of the situation, and henceforth proposing a solution in a mild-mannered, FE divergent fashion. Obviously there is remarkable strength to both of these approaches, and both types do value equally the immediate social remedy and the NITI diagnostics procedure towards a more long-term solution. But for the convergent FE user, extroverted feeling is taken more direct responsibility for, whereas the divergent extroverted feeler is more likely to retreat into introverted thinking and solve the situation in a less direct fashion. The ENFJ does tend to have an easier time taking direct responsibility for another person's emotions, and thus the simple act of cheering someone up may come easier for this type. And now let us apply these very same attitudes to introverted intuition and introverted thinking for these types. The INFJ does tend to have an easier time forming their own unique slant on a situation, but may have a harder time effectively communicating the results of their formulation. And this is because the INFJ is much more naturally convergent in the realm of NITI, and therefore much more effectively creating into this area than observing it. You see, observing introverted thinking, introverted intuition is actually necessary in order to effectively communicate it with convergent extroverted feeling. The ENFJ, however, may not so easily improvise an NITI insight on the spot, but would yet have an easier time consulting existing models and theories within their own headspace on how to deal with various different situations. And in this way, the ENFJ can even be more systematic than the INFJ, because divergent introverted thinking is much more effectively observed and abided by, and thus any kind of internal system and framework would be more easily abided by. And this is because while the more playful NITI convergence is harder to engage for this type, the type subsequently excels at observing theories and insights they have previously found to be true. So the ENFJ may be a little bit less naturally outside the box than the lens-dominant INFJ. But owing to the much more actionable theory emphasis of this type, they are more likely to already have easily observable theories and models inside their own head when going into any kind of situation. And because their internal world is so much less of a natural primordial ooze, different theories and models can be much more easily separated for this type. And thus you can think of the TI and I divergence of the ENFJ as a kind of abstract toolbox to be able to bring out as different situations present themselves. You see, convergent NITI is a naturally fluid space where reality is being constantly deconstructed and reconstructed. It is a much more chaotic world of constant change, only really held in place by the universal theories of everything that the INFJ constructs in order to keep their internal world together. And honestly, this kind of world can feel a little bit too unsettling for the ENFJ, a type that tends to naturally crave a level of security and certainty in their lives. And this need for certainty does tend to stem from the introverted intuitive authority function, which we'll be getting into later. But on the flip side of this, being an introvert, the INFJ, for all the relative fluidity of their internal world, does tend to desire a level of predictability in their external world. And therefore the INFJ does tend to be the more naturally routine-based and less exploratory of the two types. And the ENFJ, with their more convergent extroverted sensing, tends to counterbalance their need for internal certainty with a greater willingness to explore and embrace new external experiences. So you can think of the INFJ as more conceptually exploratory, and the ENFJ, depending on a subtype, more experientially exploratory. You can see the INFJ is more experientially consistent, and the ENFJ is more logically consistent. And now let us compare the different ways functions are positioned in each of these types' cognitive maps. First, let us look to the dominant axes. The INFJ is an NI dominant, which tends to be a very naturally expansive and attitudinally dynamic position. The dominant position of any function is actually so expansive that it can be remarkably difficult to actually see it, much like the air that we breathe, because the INFJ does not actually use NI as a tool, as much as they simply exist within it. This is a kind of safe space for the type, and irrespective of the impact this might have upon their mental well-being, it is not difficult for any introverted intuitive dominant to spend significantly more time within their internal world than would necessarily be healthy. The saturation threshold for the dominant function is therefore typically quite high. And the more we tend to stay within the confines of the dominant function, the more we tend to dissociate from the oppositional function, that is, the function opposing the dominant on the other side of the axis. In the case of the INFJ, this would be extroverted sensing. And as such, the INFJ usually benefits from setting various external factors in place that actively encourage the type to go outside of the heads. And the ENFJ, on the other hand, is an extroverted feeling dominant function. Again, with extroverted feeling, in this case, being like the air the ENFJ breathes, they would not necessarily even notice themselves using the function. It is often so naturally paced within this type as to feel instinctual and non-deliberate. Oftentimes an ENFJ would have to be reminded how much they are valuing social harmony and societal role. As for the ENFJ, this can just feel like more second nature than it is an actual value they hold to. And because extroverted feeling for this type is so easily paced, outside of situations that require a more hyperconvergent use of this function, where extroverted feeling becomes extremely actionable, the type tends to go a significantly longer period of time in the company of others than the INFJ does without feeling too drained. And again, this does not mean the ENFJ is going to be the life and soul of a party. Indeed, both the ENFJ and the ESFJ tend to pace themselves so well with extroverted feeling that they can just appear, for as long as everything is going according to plan, remarkably calm, chill, easygoing. Indeed, the company of loved ones is often more of a safe space for the ENFJ than within their own heads. And the ENFJ does tend to be much more naturally aware than the INFJ of the deleterious impact staying within their own heads for too long can have upon them. Indeed, many ENFJs would find their introverted thinking a more unsettling environment that they would much more rather observe than actively touch. And this can be to the extent of being master orators and experts within their field, but at the expense of more intentional theorizing within their own headspace. The default ENFJ would much rather internalize pre-existing theories, philosophies, and models, and put their efforts into properly understanding these structures and subsequently applying them. Should they render their introverted thinking as hyperconvergent of that of the INFJs, the INFJ can feel like they are on shaky ground and significantly less empowered towards external altruistic action. And as such, trust does play a big role in the ENFJ's relationship to their introverted thinking frameworks. The more vetted and reliable a theory, the more confident the ENFJ is in applying it. Now let us look to the auxiliary axes of these types. The INFJ has a rational auxiliary axis between introverted thinking and extroverted feeling, whereas the auxiliary axis of the ENFJ is between extroverted sensing and introverted intuition. The top of any given auxiliary axis is going to feature the agency function, and this would be introverted thinking for the INFJ, and thus the realm of central control within their psyche. This means, well, first of all, that the first route of solving any given problem, as mentioned previously, tends to start with introverted thinking frameworking. And the second implication is in the more possessive nature of this function position. With so much egoic energies directed towards this realm, the INFJ tends to be naturally protective over their opinions, conclusions, and even theories. And this can even be to the extent of a level of introverted thinking privacy. Oftentimes, an INFJ would employ introverted thinking simply in aid of their own internal novel experience, and there will be less natural impetus towards sharing the product of this experience with other people. And the bottom of any given auxiliary axis features the authority function. Extroverted feeling here, for the INFJ, effectively instills an outer ego drive to operate more within certain social boundaries and reflect more upon issues that have more direct relevance to human operation. This function is divergent and therefore a realm of less change for this type. Moreover, this function can be so restrictive for the INFJ as to foster more of a love-hate relationship with this function than what the ENFJ would experience, who by contrast tends to exist more within extroverted feeling, with this function being more the realm of the ego for the ENFJ. As such, the ENFJ, by contrast to the INFJ, has a more natural drive to embrace extroverted feeling. Now let's compare this to the ENFJ's auxiliary axis, this time starting from the bottom up. The authority function for the ENFJ is introverted intuition. This instills in the ENFJ a greater need to head in a more fixed trajectory, as well as map out important decisions to be made on the road ahead. There is a greater drive for this type to have the future more set in stone, with introverted intuition serving as an important source of security for the type, as well as giving the ENFJ a set of natural parameters to operate within. The ENFJ often prefers to live their life according to a grand vision or desired goal, and as with all extroverted types, the authority function here serves as a kind of internal bedrock on which external exploration can commence. And this leads neatly to the type's agency function, in this case, extroverted sensing. For the ENFJ, the fun happens not in mapping out the future, but within the moment itself, which is a point of significant disparity between each of these types. Whereas the INFJ can enjoy playing with concepts and be more flexible in their future trajectory, they tend to require more day-to-day predictability, whereas the ENFJ is typically more serious than INFJ with concepts and future plans. They typically have a greater ease at seizing the day and the magic it holds. And now let us move on to the dip functions of each of these types. Both types employ an extroverted intuitive extroverted thinking pairing amply, but in quite different ways. The INFJ employs NETE from the expression gateway, essentially introverted intuition, introverted thinking dipping into this pairing, and can thus be the more naturally playful with concepts and even methods of the two. The ENFJ, by contrast, employs TENE via the extension gateway, which has a much more serious slant to the lens-dominant pairing of the INFJ, and more attitudinally suited to managerial positions. Both types tend to have an introverted sensing, introverted feeling pairing, and thus both hold a natural kind of internal warmth and highly concretized sense of identity. Both of these types tend to enter into this pairing via the impression gateway, that is FESE into FISI, and thus this concrete internal world of both of these types can be highly affected by social feedback. However, the FISI pairing of the ENFJ is more convergent by nature, and thus more consistently adaptive to the context of their external world. There is a more natural level of adaptation here and natural molding according to external necessity. SIFI for the INFJ, however, is much more divergent for this type, and thus much more of a authoritative force pushing them forward. Some INFJs may be more individualistically inclined than the more naturally collectivistic ENFJ, for example. They may also, again, owing to the more love-hate relationship with their extroverted feeling, every now and again have a more passive, aggressive relationship to external parameters. And generally the INFJ is just more comfortable going off and doing their own thing. Emotional regulation is a little bit harder for the INFJ, but the lack of consistent NI vision is generally counterbalanced by the type's consistent authenticity and individuality, which serves as the bedrock for this type's internal theorizing. And the final point of differentiation for each of these types lies in the blind spot function. The INFJ tends to be more blind in the area of extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing, and can thus have a harder time getting to grip with new mechanisms, for example, or a string of new factual information sent their way. There's a greater need to stew on things over time via introverted thinking, internalization here, and less natural comfort taking extroverted thinking in their stride. Generally for the INFJ, introverted thinking is a lot more autonomous from extroverted thinking, and thus a lot more rational than it is empirical. Generally the INFJ relies more upon their internal models than the ENFJ does. Furthermore, exerting substantial influence over their environment is more of a learned skill for the INFJ, when extroverted feeling for the type eventually cottons on to the fact that, for example, internal decor is valued by other people. And this wouldn't be true for every INFJ because, of course, decor is still a form of artistic expression. But it does stand as one example of extroverted feeling as an authority function, driving a type to take responsibility over the TE order of their external world. And the ENFJ, by contrast, more naturally takes a degree of ownership over their external environment. They tend to have a more empirical slant, and while this isn't exactly much of a strength for either of these types, the ENFJ typically has an easier time accommodating new mechanisms. The exception here being where their actual blind spot comes into play, because the ENFJ is significantly more blind than the INFJ in the realm of introverted sensing, introverted thinking, and thus rote memorization and more precise use of internal frameworking can be more of a difficulty for this type. And what's more, general recall can also suffer a bit more for the ENFJ than the INFJ. And some ENFJs may even find themselves repeating the same mistakes more than an INFJ necessarily would. And this is not at all for lack of reflection, you understand, but more owing to the natural forward momentum of the SE agency function. Generally, the INFJ has an easier time dipping into their SITI than the ENFJ does, with the latter type typically relying more upon holistic principles, philosophy, and various meta-theories in order to guide their logical agenda. Right, so that concludes the video. I hope it's been informative, and if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the content of this video, be sure to share it with them. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by leaving a like, and it would be great to hear from you in the comment section as well. If you are still curious about what your cognitive type might be, I highly recommend checking out the CPT type service, and you can be typed by either myself or my friend Rob. If you are interested in further developing your type, or applying your natural cognition towards external pursuits, I do recommend checking out the CPT coaching service. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you would like to support the channel and the theory on an additional level, it would be absolutely amazing to see you there. I do live streams over there every single month, and we also have our active Discord community over there too. So that's it for me. Thanks again for watching, especially if you made it this far. You are awesome, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.